I'm supposed to be talking today about various digital trade agreements and the way in which Asian governments have approached digital trade. And I'm going to do this obviously very briefly because I don't have a ton of time today. So let me get right into it. I think one key issue is that lots of governments in particular would say to me, well, this is not really a problem because we have lots of digital trade and e-commerce and we haven't had any rules and it's been fine. But I just want to highlight that that's not great. And it's not great for governments, of course, but it's also not great for firms because companies need to have some rules and some guardrails in place. And in particular, what they need is consistency because that limits the risk and the amount of uncertainty that businesses face. And if you have too much uncertainty and too much risk, then it's deeply problematic for companies. And it's especially a problem for small firms that don't have the capacity, the internal capacity to manage inconsistent, overlapping kinds of rules in digital. And so one way that we are working on improving this is to look at putting digital rules or aspects of digital rules into existing trade agreements or into new, even next generation digital only trade agreements. So we've been at this for quite some time now. I just point out a few things. You know, the Australia, ASEAN, New Zealand FTA started with an e-commerce chapter that was quite extensive in 2010. We have lots of other bilateral agreements that have e-commerce chapters. And as Wendy mentioned at the very beginning of this, there are lots of economies working on different aspects of digital, including the WTO itself, and all the way through to digital-only agreements, which have been mentioned a couple of times this morning, and which I'll go into in a little more detail in just a second. They vary in each. And I think it's important for everyone to remember that digital trade is not just about an e-commerce chapter. There are also lots of enabling provisions, even for e-commerce goods trade, like paperless trade commitments, customs procedures, digital signatures, e-signatures, which is critical to operating a company in the digital world or COVID world, lots of services that need to be opened and allowed to flow in the digital space. There are some specific sectoral commitments and even things around intellectual property rights and who owns ideas in a digital setting and who owns data and so forth. I think there's some really interesting parts of digital trade that are not always embedded in an e-commerce chapter. Typically, we talk in the trade space about e-commerce as the umbrella, and then digital trade fits within there. But for the rest of the world who's not doing trade agreements, digital is the sort of umbrella, and e-commerce is trade in goods, usually meaning off a platform like Amazon. And I think it's important for especially officials to remember that there's a lot of things that get embedded in e-commerce. And in particular, if we're going to talk about creating digital-only agencies or entities or even institutions that just deal with digital, this is going to rapidly, in my view, get complicated because you need to think about traditional areas as well as the data or digital elements of trade. So it's your services, your investment, your data rules, IP rules, standards that are related to digital, consumer protection rules, development problems, capacity building, and so on. And because digital is actually, I keep calling it the connective tissue that binds together so many other parts of the economy, I think it's very hard to imagine a digital only ministry because they would ultimately be the government, in my view, right? As we go more and more online, or as we have more and more of our activities that are also complemented by an online presence or an online capacity, eventually the sort of digital ministry would end up, if it was doing its job well, being the government or being a big part of what the government is. And so I think we need to be a bit cautious about suggesting that we have a digital agency or digital ministry, because we should view this as a horizontal issue connecting lots of different areas. And the key goal, in my view, ought to be to enable, especially the smaller firms, the micro multinationals, to find markets, materials, customers, et cetera, anywhere in the globe, because digital doesn't know geographic borders. Let me just highlight briefly as well the importance of COVID. If we've learned anything from the last year, it's that we need to have an seamless online experience, or as seamless as it can be, in order for us to participate in life as we know it, including moving, events like this one online and so forth. And so I think key as well is to remember that governments don't have to do it all. Government just has to make the enabling environment and allow firms to get on with the business of creating the environment that we all want to live in as consumers and companies and so forth. Okay, so let me then go through some of the provisions in these trade agreements. Most of them include things like paperless trading wherever possible, the use of electronic signatures, electronic authorization. So we've had these commitments forever, and governments have been remarkably slow to actually make it happen. But COVID shows us that if you can't do an electronic signature, you're in trouble. If you have to fly somewhere to have someone sign and chop a document, this is a challenge in COVID. We need to think again, much harder than before, about lowering logistics costs, and especially for small size, small value shipments. There are real problems around payments. We have a new paper coming out on payments, specifically cross-border retail payments, which is a nightmare. All of our small businesses use bank transfers. So because you use bank transfers to get payments cross-border, it means you can't sell to consumers, because no consumer is going to go to their bank and pay money for that. So I think it's very important to think about all of these other elements, including the data flow stuff, which most people focus on, location of delivery of where the data is housed and so forth. And all of it requires, I think, regular engagement with stakeholders, because governments especially are not familiar with all of the aspects of digital. Let me talk briefly about the 3 agreements that I think that should be watched in particular in this region. So CPTPP, the new Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, DEPA, that's been mentioned several times this morning, and then the digital economy agreements. There's one in place now with Singapore and Australia, and another one under negotiation with Korea, and another one with the UK. Now, this is a lot of information, but let me just point out that as we've gone forward in time, CPTPP is the column on the right, and the DEA is the column on the left. There's variation between them. As we go forward in time, and the CPTPP is the oldest of these 3 agreements, you tend to add more and more topics to the agenda. And so you can see the DEA between Singapore and Australia has 23 different elements embedded in it. And I would point out that getting a check or an X doesn't necessarily mean that it's a full binding commitment. It just means it appears in the agreement. And in some cases, we can argue that cooperation commitments are vitally important, and in others we say legally binding is actually quite critical. And so the point of this chart is to just say, over time, we're adding more and more things to the agenda and more elements that are important. And the last thing that I'll say is, why do we have this variation? Well, part of it is about the age. Part of it is because these are countries that have had past experiences working together. So the members of the DEPA and the members who are currently negotiating DEAs are all part of the CPTPP. So you can see that sort of evolution of the agreements coming from past experiences. They also come from different objectives. So if you're making a standalone trade agreement, then there are certain elements that you can include and certain elements that are harder to include. If you are modernizing and updating an existing FTA like Australia and New Zealand, Australia and Singapore, it's easier to build out, I would argue, some of the more comprehensive commitments and more legally binding commitments, because you will have the FTA structure backing up the digital commitments. If you're doing just a digital only agreement like the DEPA, then you need to think harder about maybe cooperation commitments. And as Wendy mentioned earlier, maybe that sort of principles approach. These are kinds of areas where we intend to cooperate, but because it's a standalone digital agreement, not backed by an FTA, it doesn't have the binding nature to it, which could be a good thing, could be a challenge. But the point is that it's a variation in the way in which we negotiate, in the way in which we anchor these commitments. And so you get differences between agreements depending on how they are anchored in institutional structure. And I think the bottom line, and this is my last point, is just to say there are lots of ways to get where we would like to go. And I think what is useful about looking at the approaches that different governments have taken in Asia on digital trade, it should give you a bit more confidence that we can eventually develop rules that expand to more and more different constellations of countries, with the giant caveat, especially on behalf of the companies that we work with, that more different variations is not so desirable for firms either. So what we don't want is a proliferation of agreements that are all slightly different from one another, because in the digital space, it's hard to know which agreement applies to whatever it is that I'm trying to accomplish. So obviously, the more that we can get buy-in to some kind of consistent common rules or consistent common principles, the better it is for businesses in particular, and I would argue on behalf of consumers, better for consumers, because then we can buy and sell from anywhere in the world. And that micro multinational can survive to fight another day. So let me stop there and happy to take questions and comments from others. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Deborah.